I was handcuffed right in the middle of the glass-walled boardroom overlooking Midtown Manhattan. The cold white ceiling lights shone down on the long walnut table like a runway, where the men and women in expensive suits had just applauded my older brother's leadership vision. I could still hear that applause, like a thin layer of foam covering the truth that was about to be drowned. When the steel cuffs snapped shut around my wrists, the metal cold enough to bite into my skin, I saw Victor Briggs's smile at the end of the table. A very small smile, just enough for me to understand. Only then did I realize this wasn't a meeting. It was an execution. Briggs Group was our family's financial empire, headquartered in Manhattan. A limestone building with a classic facade, but inside it was technology and money running like blood. Along the hall hung photos of my grandfather shaking hands with the mayor, my father standing in front of the New York Stock Exchange, and most recently, a magazine cover featuring Victor, the third-generation successor. I used to believe this place was home. I used to believe family was the one thing that couldn't be bought or sold. But in that very morning, I understood that in New York, everything had a price, even blood. I am Colton Briggs, 32 years old, Vice President of Strategy, the one who led Briggs Group's expansion into fintech and restructured the investment portfolio after the crisis. I wasn't a rebel. I worked 16 hours a day, slept on the office sofa when needed, and kept the Briggs name clean like an oath. Victor was 7 years older than me, the chief executive officer, the kind of man who knew how to turn stories into weapons. He always spoke about family responsibility, as if he were speaking about a throne. Besides Victor and me, there was my mother, Margaret, seated to the right, her hands resting on a stack of documents as if she were praying. The rest were the board of directors, in-house counsel, and a few strangers. Strangers in dark coats standing near the door, eyes that didn't belong to business. Victor stood up, his voice calm, as if he were presenting a quarterly report. He projected a series of charts on the screen, then switched to copies of emails, wire transfers, and contracts with an overseas consulting firm. My name was on every page. My signature sat beneath every line. He said the word embezzlement, as if pressing each syllable, said the word corruption, as if chewing something sweet. I flipped through the pages quickly, my mind feeling torn out of my body. There were emails I had never written. There were accounts I had never opened. There were recorded phone calls with a voice so similar to mine it was terrifying. But the wording wasn't mine. I stood up, my chair making a small screech against the floor. I said they were wrong. I said this was a trap. I turned to Victor, searching for the smallest sign of hesitation. A blink, a tremor. There was nothing. He sighed as if I were the foolish younger brother making a scene. Then he turned to the board and said a sentence that chilled me. I'm heartbroken, but the law is the law. We have to protect the shareholders and the honor of Briggs Group. My mother looked at me, her lips barely moving as if she wanted to say something. Then she fell silent. In her eyes, there was something locked tight. I suddenly understood. She had known. Or at least, she had chosen not to know. I looked at the board members, the people who used to call me reliable, sharp, steady. Now they avoided my gaze as if I were a disease. The company lawyer slid a proposal toward me to cooperate with the investigation. Someone on the board asked if I wanted to voluntarily surrender my devices. Those weren't questions. They were hammers. The boardroom door opened. 2 federal agents walked in, their badges catching the ceiling lights. One of them read the arrest warrant in an even tone, like reading safety instructions on an airplane. Everything in me wanted to scream. I wanted to throw the documents to the floor, flip the table, point at Victor in front of everyone. But I stood still. A strange instinct held me back. If I exploded, I would become exactly the image they wanted. I looked at Victor again. He gave a very slight nod, as if ending a vote. They handcuffed me. A hand pushed me toward the door. Camera clicks from the hallway sounded like hail. As I passed my mother, she didn't stand up. She only tightened her grip on the papers until her knuckles went white. I heard Victor say behind me, loud enough for everyone to hear, Colton, if you cooperate, it'll be lighter. That sentence was like a thin blade, because it pretended to be kindness. The elevator went down, as if lowering me into an invisible basement. In the lobby, the press was already waiting. I saw flashes, microphones, questions thrown at my face like stones. How much did you embezzle? Are you involved in money laundering? What does your family say? I didn't answer. I only heard my footsteps on the stone floor, the cuffs clinking together, my heart beating like a hammer. Outside, the Manhattan winter wind cut into my face. The prisoner transport vehicle door shut, the heavy sound like closing a coffin. As the vehicle rolled forward, I looked through the barred window. The Briggs Group building fell behind me, like a painting I once belonged to. I didn't know how long I would be in prison. Didn't know who would stand up and tell the truth. Didn't know what my life had left. But in that moment, something rose up very clearly, cold and solid as steel. Victor had won one battle. Just one. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. I told myself, without a sound, as if carving it into bone, I would live. I would watch. I would remember every face that turned away. And one day, when they believed I had vanished completely, I would return. Not to beg forgiveness, not to plead for fairness, but to take back what was mine. I opened my eyes and stared at my faint reflection in the glass. In those eyes, for the first time in many years, there was no longer a naive faith in family. There was only an oath. I heard the gavel strike the wood like a dry heartbeat. The sound wasn't loud, but it cut straight through every thought in my head, as if someone had just closed the lid of a box I was trapped inside. In that moment, I understood very clearly. My life had officially turned to another chapter, and this chapter no longer had room for innocence. The federal courtroom in New York was colder than I expected. The gray stone walls, the American flag behind the judge, and the long wooden benches for spectators created a space that was both solemn and cruel. The press filled both sides, their eyes no longer looking at me as a human being, but as a headline about to be printed in bold. My name had become a story, no longer a person. I sat at the defendant's table, wearing the gray suit prepared by the lawyer, but it felt like borrowed clothing. Beside me was my defense attorney, hastily appointed after Briggs Group announced it had cut all ties with me. Across from me was the prosecutor, his face calm, his voice sharp like paper. In the witness seats, Victor sat straight-backed, his hands neatly on his knees, like a model older brother who had come to save the family's honor. They began reading the charges again. Each number, each transaction, each email was linked together like a chain. I listened, and no longer felt as if I were listening about myself. Everything was too perfect, too logical, too clean. There was no space left for doubt. I knew that if I were an outsider, I would have believed it too. My lawyer tried to argue back, but he had no original data. The company's internal servers had been under maintenance. The backup copies were declared no longer available. Employees who had worked directly with me either refused to testify or said they couldn't remember clearly. I looked at them, the people who used to drink coffee with me every morning, who used to call me Colton instead of Mr. Briggs. Now they lowered their heads, avoiding my eyes, as if memory itself could be bought. When Victor was called to testify, the courtroom almost held its breath. He spoke slowly, his voice trembling just enough, like an older brother hurt by having to accuse his own sibling. He talked about my change, about the pressure of power, about abnormal signs he had tried to ignore because of family bonds. I looked at him, and for a very brief moment, I almost laughed. If I hadn't been on trial, I might have applauded that performance. He said he had struggled for a long time before bringing this to light. He said he only wanted to protect the company, protect the family. He said my name as if he were sending off someone who had already died. I listened to every sentence, every word, and realized he wasn't killing me. He was burying me. I stood up when it was my turn to speak. The whole courtroom turned toward me. I looked straight at the judge, then at Victor. I said I was innocent. I said the evidence had been fabricated. I said this was a conspiracy. but my words fell to the floor like small shards of glass, not big enough for anyone to bend down and pick up. I had nothing in my hands but the truth, and in a courtroom, truth without documents is just noise. The judge listened, his face showing no emotion. I didn't blame him. He was only doing his job. But that cold fairness made me understand that I had already lost. Not because I was wrong, but because I was alone. The sentence was announced. 7 years in federal prison for financial corruption. I heard that number like hearing an empty space. Not 7 years, but 7 birthdays, 7 winters, 7 times the world would change while I stood outside it. I turned to look at Victor. He lowered his head, his hand on his forehead, like a man carrying great pain. I knew that if there were cameras there, that moment would be cut into a symbol of the sacrifice of the older brother. I was told to stand, handcuffed again. This time I didn't flinch. The metal against my skin was a reminder. Everything had been decided. I turned toward my mother. She looked at me, eyes red, but didn't step forward. The distance between us was only a few meters, but longer than the road I was about to walk. When I was let out, the courtroom door closed behind me with a deep echo. That sound didn't just close a door. It closed an entire chapter of my life. I walked through the long corridor, where fluorescent lights shone down on the cold, tiled floor. Each step echoed like a confirmation. I had officially become a criminal in the eyes of the world. In the prison transport vehicle, I looked out the window and saw New York pass by like a film in which I was no longer the main character. The buildings, the billboards, the rushing people, everything kept living. Only I was held back. In that moment, I was no longer angry. I only felt empty. And in that emptiness, a very clear thought appeared. If I let this silence swallow me, Victor would win forever. I lowered my head, closed my eyes, and for the first time since my arrest, I didn't think about clearing my name. I thought about surviving. I thought about learning. I thought about waiting. I understood that from today on, my silence was no longer weakness. It was the only weapon I still possessed. The steel door closed behind me with a heavy echo, as if someone had just locked my entire past outside. That sound was not only metal against metal, it was the boundary between Colton Briggs of the free world and Colton Briggs of federal prison. I stood still for a few seconds, breathing in the damp, cold smell of the corridor, then moved forward, like a man who understood there was no road back. The federal prison in Pennsylvania was not like what movies had painted. It was not loud, not chaotic, but silently and frighteningly orderly. The gray walls stretched endlessly, fluorescent lights made everything look pale, and the guards' footsteps echoed evenly like an emotionless clock. In this place, time did not pass. It only stacked upon itself. They led me to my cell, a metal bed, a small table, an old sink, and a narrow window just wide enough to see a piece of sky. My cellmate was a middle-aged man, his hair almost completely gray, his eyes calm and deep. He looked at me, nodded lightly, did not ask my name, did not ask my crime. Here, everyone's past was something that did not need to be spoken. In the first days, I felt like a foreign object, a fallen rich kid entering a world of people accustomed to loss. I was looked at with eyes both curious and contemptuous. Some called me CEO. Some called me discount rich boy. I did not react. I understood that if I reacted, I would lose the last piece of self-control I had. I began to observe. I observed how people spoke, how they stayed silent, how they avoided conflict, and how they survived. I realized that in prison, strength was not in fists, but in knowing who you were and knowing what you wanted. And I knew that if I wanted to survive, I had to turn this place into a school. I became familiar with my cellmate. He had once been a corporate lawyer, sentenced for being involved in a fraudulent deal he was not strong enough to escape. He no longer carried hatred. He only had fatigue and a mind that was still very sharp. We began to talk every night about law, about legal loopholes, about how large corporations protected themselves, and about how they destroyed a person when necessary. I asked to work in the prison library. It was the only place where I still felt like Colton Briggs. I read books on law, finance, economics, and biographies of people who had lost everything and returned. I took notes on every page. I rewrote them in my own language. I turned knowledge into something usable, not to show off, but to understand. Every time I heard news about Briggs Group on the common television in the block, my heart tightened. Victor appeared on the screen with his familiar smile, talking about growth, innovation, and the future. But beneath those beautiful words, I saw dishonest numbers. I saw haste. I saw a lack of control. I understood. He was using power like a man who was not capable of holding it for long. One evening, my cellmate said to me, "You shouldn't hate him. You should learn from him." That sentence kept me silent for a long time. I realized that if I only kept hatred inside me, I would remain a victim forever. But if I turned everything into a lesson, I would become the one in control. I began to write down every strategic mistake Victor could make. I wrote down every scenario that could happen to Briggs Group in the next 5 years. I wrote as a man with no power, but who had never given up the mindset of someone who once stood at the center of power. Those pages were not a diary. They were a map. Time passed in silence. I got used to the sound of locks every night, used to the tasteless meals, used to no one calling my name except my prisoner number. But inside me, there was something that never got used to surrender. Every day, I reminded myself that I was not dead. I was only in a temporary phase of my life. Some nights, I lay staring at the ceiling, thinking about my mother, thinking about Victor, thinking about the boardroom where everything began. I no longer cried. I no longer felt angry. I only felt a cold clarity. I understood that if I was still alive, I still had a chance. And if I still had a chance, I still had a responsibility to myself. One day, I read a small piece of news. Briggs Group's stock dropped sharply after a wrong investment decision. No one in the block cared about that news. But to me, it was like a small bell ringing in the darkness. I did not smile. I only nodded. I knew that what I had seen in my analysis was beginning to become reality. That night, I closed my notebook, looked at my cellmate and said, "I will get out of here." He looked at me, did not smile, did not doubt, only said, "If you get out, don't forget what you learned here." I nodded. I understood that this prison had taken away my freedom, but it had given me something Victor had never had. Time to clearly see myself and the world. I lay down on the metal bed and closed my eyes. In the darkness, I no longer saw myself as a prisoner. I saw myself as a man preparing for the day I would step out with a sharper mind, a colder heart, and a clearer goal than ever before in my life. The day I was released, the New York sky was gray like an unfinished wall. I stood in front of the slowly opening iron gate, hearing the dry sound of the hinges, and waited a brief moment to be sure I was no longer being held back. No one was waiting. No flowers. No car. Only a road leading out and a familiar sense of emptiness. I stepped across that boundary without turning back, because I knew I had no reason left to look behind me. The city welcomed me with indifference. Manhattan was still crowded, still noisy, still cold, just as it had been when I left. The tall buildings reflected the dull sky. Strangers passed by without knowing who I was, and without needing to know. To them, I was just a man returned to the world. To myself, I was a man returned to himself. I pulled the only small bag I carried. Inside it a few old clothes and several notebooks with worn corners. Those notebooks were my only real possessions. They contained everything I had learned, analyzed, and mapped out during my years inside. I knew that if I still had a future, it was in those pages, not in the money I no longer had. The first person to come to me was Ethan Moore. He stood across the street, leaning against an old car, thin but with the firm eyes of a lawyer who had never truly surrendered. When he saw me, he didn't smile, didn't congratulate me. He only nodded, like greeting someone who had just returned from a long journey. We sat in a small cafe near the station. The cafe was noisy, but within those sounds, our conversation was strangely quiet. Ethan spoke directly. Briggs Group was in trouble. Shareholders were beginning to doubt. Some of Victor's decisions were considered rushed and lacking strategy. The reputation he had built as the suffering older brother was slowly fading. I listened without commenting, only memorizing. Every sentence Ethan said matched what I had predicted in prison. He asked whether I planned to return to the company. That question kept me silent for a long time. I looked at the coffee in front of me, its thin foam slowly fading, like what remained of a time when I believed I belonged there. I told Ethan I would not return through the front door. If I returned, I would return as someone they could not control. Ethan understood. He did not ask more. He only said that if I needed him, he was still there. Those words were not loud, but to me, they were a rare support in a city where no one else stood on my side. After leaving the cafe, I walked for a long time. I passed streets I used to drive through without ever noticing. I looked at office windows still lit, people still working tirelessly, and I realized, this world does not wait for anyone. If I stood still, I would be left behind once again. That night, I rented a small room in a cheap hotel in Queens. The room was narrow, the bed creaked, and the window faced a brick wall. But I didn't feel bad. I felt safe. This was the first place in years where I could be alone, without iron locks, without the sound of guards' footsteps. I opened my notebooks and spread them across the bed. I reread every line, every diagram, every scenario. I did not read them as memories. I read them as a man preparing for a battle. I realized I was no longer the Colton Briggs I had been before. The man who believed in family had disappeared. The one who remained understood that power belonged only to those who knew how to wait. In my mind, a name appeared. Reed Capital, the international investment fund I had studied carefully in prison. An organization loyal to no family, only to profit and strategy. I knew that if I wanted a chance, I had to go to them. But I also knew I could not go as a recently released prisoner seeking revenge. I had to go as a man carrying value. I opened the old laptop Ethan had lent me, logged into a new email, and wrote a short letter. I did not tell my past. I only spoke about Briggs Group, about the risks the company was hiding, about the opportunities the market had not yet seen. I signed, Colton Briggs. No title, no explanation. When I pressed send, I did not feel nervous. I only felt that I had just dropped the first stone into the water. It could sink. It could also create ripples. But at least, it had been thrown. I leaned back against the wall and looked at the low ceiling of the room. I thought about Victor. I thought about the boardroom. I thought about the gavel striking the wooden table. But this time, those memories no longer hurt me. They only reminded me that I had walked a road not everyone was strong enough to walk. I closed my eyes, breathed slowly, and understood that the next chapter of my life no longer began with tears, but with clarity. I did not know whether Reed Capital would reply. I did not know how far my plan would go. But I knew one thing very clearly. From today on, I was no longer a man waiting for fate. I was the one beginning to rewrite it. The meeting with Isabella Reed took place on a light, rainy afternoon. I stood in front of Reed Capital's glass building in Midtown Manhattan, watching raindrops slide down the reflective surface showing my own face, and wondered whether that woman would see me as an opportunity or merely a risk. I adjusted my collar, took a deep breath, and walked in, like entering another courtroom, but this time, I was not being judged. I was placing myself on the scale. Reed Capital's office was spacious and bright, not showy, but it carried the quiet power of money and intellect. The glass walls looked down on traffic like the city's veins. The receptionist led me into a small meeting room. I sat down, placed my thin briefcase on the table, and waited. In that moment, I felt clearly that I was no longer the Colton Briggs of the past. I was a man with nothing left to lose, and that was exactly why I was no longer afraid. Isabella Reed entered a few minutes later. She did not carry the cold air of a typical investor, nor did she try to appear friendly. She simply looked at me, for a long time, as if reading a book that had not yet been opened. Her eyes were sharp, but not cruel. I stood up, shook her hand, and felt a grip firm enough to remind me that in this room, power did not belong to me. We sat across from each other, Isabella did not ask about my past. She asked directly, "What do you want from Reed Capital?" That question made me understand that if I started talking about prison, about Victor, about betrayal, I would lose immediately. I answered that I wanted a chance to cooperate, and that I wanted to prove Briggs Group was heading in the wrong direction. Isabella raised her eyebrow very slightly, like a reflex of someone who had heard too many similar stories. She said Reed Capital did not invest in emotions. She invested in data. I nodded. I opened my briefcase and took out the analyses I had prepared over many years. Not copies from the company, but models I had built myself based on public information, market trends, and strategic decisions Victor had announced. I talked about rushed investments, about Briggs Group expanding too fast into areas without solid foundations. I pointed out what Victor ignored because he was too confident in his own image. I did not speak with the voice of a betrayed younger brother. I spoke with the voice of an analyst. Isabella did not interrupt. She simply turned each page, her eyes moving quickly and precisely. After a while, she placed the papers down and looked at me. She said that technically, what I presented was all reasonable. But she did not understand why I was the one sitting here instead of Victor. That question was not insulting. It was simply the truth. I stayed silent for a few seconds, then said it was because I had trusted the wrong person, and because I had paid the price for it. Isabella asked whether I was seeking revenge. I looked straight at her and answered that if I only wanted revenge, I would not need Reed Capital. I would only need time. I said I wanted to control the game, not to destroy a person, but to fix a system that had been placed in the hands of someone not capable of holding it. The room fell silent. I could feel each second passing. I did not know whether I had convinced her or made her more cautious. Finally, Isabella stood up, walked to the glass wall, and looked down at the street. She said Reed Capital always looked for people who could see what others could not. But Reed Capital never placed all its bets on a single story. She turned back, looked at me, and said they would not invest heavily right away. They would start with a small share package through intermediary companies. If what I predicted was correct, they would continue. If I was wrong, everything would stop there. I nodded. To me, that was not doubt. It was fairness. We shook hands again. This time I felt her grip differently, not as an evaluation, but as a silent promise of an experiment. When I left the building, I did not feel like I had just signed a contract. I felt like I had just placed a chess piece on a board Victor did not even know existed. On the way back, I walked very slowly. The rain had stopped. The city reflected lights on the wet pavement like another map of New York. I thought about Victor, about what he was doing, and about what he had no idea was beginning. I did not smile. I did not feel triumphant. I only felt a cold certainty. From this moment, I was no longer outside the game. That night, I opened my notebook and wrote a single line. The first move has been placed. I did not write anything else. I did not need to. I knew that from today on, everything would begin to move. And once a machine has begun to move, it does not stop just because one person wants it to. I turned off the light, lay down and looked at the ceiling in the darkness. I did not think about victory. I did not think about defeat. I only thought about the road ahead, a road no longer meant for emotion, but for clarity. And in that clarity, I knew I was going in the right direction. Victor began to feel that something was wrong on a very ordinary morning. He was standing in front of the mirror in his private office at Briggs Group, adjusting his tie, looking at his familiar face, and for the first time in many years, that look was no longer certain. I was not there, but I knew that moment existed because every power, when it starts to shake, creates a very small crack before it collapses. I knew it because I was the one behind the numbers that were keeping him awake. Through Reed Capital and intermediary companies, we began to buy Briggs Group shares little by little, quietly, without drawing attention. Each transaction was small enough to avoid suspicion, but steady enough to form an irreversible current. I did not appear. I did not sign my name. I only sat in a temporarily rented room in Brooklyn, watching the charts slowly rise on the screen, and understanding that the wheel had begun to turn. The first rumors appeared in a shareholders' meeting. A major shareholder questioned the shift in voting power. Victor answered calmly, saying it was just normal restructuring. But when he spoke, I knew he was lying to himself. Because no one can control something they can no longer clearly see. Ethan updated me on every detail. His voice on the phone no longer carried the usual calm of a lawyer who only observed. There was a very restrained excitement in it. He said Victor had begun calling internal meetings more frequently. He said Victor asked about names that did not exist. He said Victor began to suspect even those who had once been most loyal to him. I listened without commenting. I did not need to comment. I knew that feeling. It was the feeling of a man realizing for the first time that he no longer controlled the room. While Victor tried to maintain his external image, I continued working in silence. I analyzed every new financial report, every investment decision, every project Briggs Group announced. I was not looking for faults. I was only looking for truth. And the truth was very simple. Victor was managing with the confidence of a man who had never had to pay the price. Reed Capital began to accelerate. The initial small share packages were combined into ratios large enough to appear in internal reports. The names of intermediary companies began to be mentioned in the boardroom. Victor did not know who stood behind them, but he knew one thing. Someone was stepping into his territory. One evening, Ethan told me that Victor had requested an internal investigation. Not to find me, but to find the invisible enemy. The way he used that word almost made me laugh, because I was not invisible. I simply no longer stood where he was used to seeing me. Victor began to change. His speeches to the press became shorter. His familiar smile became stiffer. Safe answers appeared more often. He spoke about stability, about rebalancing, about risk control. That was not the language of a man who was winning. That was the language of a man who was defending. I followed everything through the screen. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel angry. I only felt a very strange calm. Because for the first time since I had been handcuffed in that boardroom years ago, I was no longer the passive one. I was the one shaping the rhythm of the story. One day, Reed Capital sent me a short report. The share ratio they held had passed a threshold the board could not ignore. I read that report very slowly. I did not see victory. I only saw responsibility. Because from that moment, everything was no longer a strategic game. It had become an unavoidable confrontation. Victor finally realized it. He publicly spoke about a financial force manipulating Briggs Group stock. He called on shareholders to unite. He spoke about protecting the family legacy. To outsiders, those words sounded like a rightful warning. But to me, they were only signs of fear wrapped in noble language. I did not respond. I did not appear. I let Victor speak to the darkness, because I understood that a man who loses control reveals himself most when he tries to appear strong. In my small room, I opened my notebook and wrote scenarios for the next step. I did not write with emotion. I wrote with probability. I knew Victor would make mistakes. Not because he was foolish, but because he had never learned how to lose. That night, I stood by the window looking at the city lights stretching like a river of fire. I thought about the two of us, about the path that had separated long ago. I no longer hoped he would understand me. I only hoped he would finally understand the feeling of being pushed out of the very world he once believed belonged to him. I whispered to myself without sound, "You will know soon, Victor. Not by words, but by truth." I returned to the table, turned off the screen, and understood that from this moment on, the game had entered a stage where neither of us could turn back. I was no longer the condemned younger brother. I was the man waiting for the moment to step into the light. And Victor, though he had not yet seen me, had already begun to fear his own shadow. The shareholders' meeting was scheduled on a bright, hot morning. Manhattan that day was so bright it looked like a stage already lit, waiting for its climax. I stood in the lobby of the Briggs Group building, looking up at the glass reflecting the sky. And for the first time in many years, I no longer felt like an outsider. I knew that once I walked through that door, the story would no longer belong to Victor alone. I did not wear an expensive suit. I only wore simple, neat clothes like someone attending a meeting, not a revenge. In my pocket was a shareholder pass issued by Reed Capital, a small card, but enough to open a door Victor had believed I would never have the right to enter again. The meeting room was larger than I remembered. Familiar faces sat around the long table, but their eyes were different. No more absolute confidence, no more certainty. Victor sat in the central seat, back straight, hands clasped together, his face calm to the point of stiffness. He was trying to hold control with posture. When I walked in, no one spoke, only a few very small whispers. Victor looked up. His eyes stayed on me one beat longer. In that moment, I clearly saw recognition, not immediate fear, but the disbelief of a man who could not accept that the past had just walked into the room. He stood up, said my name, as if calling a shadow. He asked what right I had to attend this meeting. Before I could answer, Isabella Reed stood up. Her voice was clear, calm, and carried the weight of money and law. She said Reed Capital was now a major shareholder, and I was their legal representative in today's meeting. The room fell completely silent. I saw quick glances exchanged among board members. Victor turned to Isabella, then back to me. This time, his eyes were no longer surprised. They were cautious. The meeting continued by procedure. Financial reports were presented. Numbers were read. I listened without interrupting. I let Victor finish his role because I knew the climax was not in arguing, but in reversing the order. When the open discussion began, Isabella requested the floor for me. Victor hesitated for a second, then nodded. Perhaps he thought I was only a symbol, Reed Capital's last attempt to apply pressure. He did not know I had waited for this moment for years. I stood up. I did not talk about prison. I did not talk about betrayal. I only spoke about wrong investment decisions, about inflated projects, about losses hidden under beautiful reports. I spoke calmly, like a man reading an analysis, not a man telling his own life. Each time I presented a number, I looked into Victor's eyes. I did not look for regret. I only looked to make sure he understood. I did not come here to beg. I came here to end a lie that had lasted too long. When I finished, the room fell into silence. Some shareholders lowered their heads to review documents. Some looked at Victor. He stood up to argue back. He said I was just a failed man seeking revenge. He said I was being manipulated by Reed Capital. He said my name like a stain. I did not answer immediately. I only nodded, then signaled to Isabella. She opened another file. Inside were evidence of fabricated data from years ago, circular money transfers, and connections between Victor and several intermediary companies. I did not need to explain much. The numbers spoke for themselves. Victor looked at the pages, his face changing color quickly. He said it was fabricated, but his voice was no longer firm. The board began to stir. One member requested independent verification. Another demanded Victor's executive authority be suspended. And then, like a scene already scripted, the meeting room door opened. 2 federal financial investigators walked in. I did not look at them. I looked at Victor. In that moment, I did not see an older brother. I only saw a man facing his own consequences. They read his name. They read the charges. The handcuffs closed around Victor's wrists, just as cold as they once had on mine. He turned to look at me. That look no longer held hatred. It only held the emptiness of a man who had just understood that the game had truly ended. The room was in chaos for a few minutes. The board called for an adjournment. The press outside began to grow louder. I remained seated, did not stand, did not leave. I did not feel victory. I only felt a circle closing. When Victor was led out, he did not turn back. I did not call his name either. Between us, there was nothing left to say. Any words now would be unnecessary. Isabella placed her hand on the table, looked at me, then at the board. She said the meeting would continue at another time, with a new order. I nodded. I knew the next chapter of the story was no longer about Victor and me. It was about what would be rebuilt from the ruins. I left the meeting room last. The corridor was long, the lights still cold and white, but I no longer felt I was walking in darkness. I did not think about revenge. I did not think about victory. I only thought of one simple thing. At last, the truth had a place to stand. The shareholders' meeting was reconvened only 2 days later. There was no longer the noise of the press, no longer the curious eyes from the previous session. This time, The room was so quiet that I could clearly hear the soft hum of the air conditioner above. I sat in the seat reserved for the major shareholders' representative, looking down at the wooden table that had witnessed too many power struggles, and realized I was sitting here not as a victor, but as a man who had to make a choice. Isabella Reed sat beside me, calm, as if everything that had just happened was only one step in a longer plan. All members of the board were present. Some looked at me with caution. Some looked at me with curiosity. No one looked at me as a convicted man anymore. I understood that my image in their eyes had changed, but that change did not come from sympathy. It came from power. The acting chairman opened the meeting. He spoke about the urgent situation of Briggs Group, about the need to restructure leadership, and about the board's responsibility to make a quick but careful decision. When he mentioned my name, the whole room looked toward me, as if waiting to see whether I would become part of the solution or part of the risk. I stood up. In that moment, I did not think about Victor. I did not think about prison. I did not think about the years I had lost. I only thought about one simple question. What did I want Briggs Group to become? I said I had not come to destroy the family legacy. I had come to correct a path that had gone wrong for too long. I said that if the board trusted me, I would not lead with arrogance, but with responsibility. No one applauded, but I saw a few very slight nods. That was not support. That was consideration. And in this world, consideration is sometimes more valuable than praise. Isabella stood up after me. She said Reed Capital was ready to continue investing long-term, but only if Briggs Group had a new leadership team that was transparent and clear-minded enough. She said that among the candidates, the only name the fund was willing to bet on was Colton Briggs. The room fell silent again. I did not turn to look at Isabella. I did not need to. I knew she was not speaking for me. She was speaking for the fund's interest. And precisely because of that, her words carried weight. The board began to discuss. Questions were raised. Concerns were voiced. I answered each one, without defending, without attacking. I did not try to prove I was better than Victor. I only proved I was different from Victor. And that difference, in this context, was exactly what they were looking for. After nearly an hour, the vote was held. I did not look at the result immediately. I looked at the table. I looked at the small scratches that had probably been there for a very long time. I thought about my grandfather, about my father, and about what they would think if they saw me sitting here in this situation. I did not know the answer. I only knew I was here, and I could not turn away from this moment. When the acting chairman announced the result, I heard my name mentioned with a majority of supporting votes. There was no cheering. There was no excitement. Only a very quiet transition. I nodded, almost by reflex, and for a moment, I felt a very real weight on my shoulders. Not the weight of power, but the weight of responsibility. The meeting ended faster than I expected. People stood up one by one, shook hands, exchanged a few polite words. I remained alone in the room, looked around and realized I no longer felt like a stranger here. But I also no longer felt ownership. I only felt that I had temporarily been entrusted with something larger than myself. Isabella came to me and quietly congratulated me. I answered with a nod. I did not say thank you, not because I was ungrateful, but because I understood that from now on, every thank you would have to be proven by action. When I left the Briggs Group building, the Manhattan sky had turned a pale orange of late afternoon. I stood on the steps, looked at the flow of people passing by, and for the first time in many years, I no longer felt that I was running away from something or chasing something. I simply stood still and felt that I was in the right place. I thought about Victor. I no longer felt resentment. I also no longer wanted to prove anything to him. I understood that everyone had to pay for their choices. I had paid with freedom. He had paid with power. No one truly won in this story. Only the truth remained. That night, I sat alone in my new office, the room that had once belonged to Victor. I did not change anything. I did not remove the paintings. I did not change the desk. I only sat down, opened the window, and let the city wind flow in. I did not feel that I had become another person. I only felt that I had returned to myself, but with deeper understanding. I opened the last notebook, the one that had followed me from prison until today, and wrote one line. Everything ends here, so everything else can begin. I wrote nothing more. I closed the notebook, as if closing a chapter of my life. I knew that from tomorrow on, I would face hundreds of difficult decisions. I knew there would be mistakes. I knew there would be opposition. But I also knew one very clear thing. I no longer lived to prove I was innocent. I lived to prove I was worthy. I stood up, turned off the light, and walked out of the office. The corridor was long, but no longer cold. I did not think about the past. I did not think about the distant future. I only thought about my next step. And in that step, I understood that at last, my life was no longer defined by what I had lost, but by what I chose to keep.